NTSB. And joining us today are my colleagues on the board, Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Member Jennifer Homedy, Member Michael Graham, and Member Tom Chapman. Today we meet in open session as required by the government and the Sunshine Act to consider the rapid descent into terrain of a chartered Sikorsky S-76B helicopter in Calabasas, California on the morning of January the 26th of last year. The flight departed John Wayne Airport, Orange County in Santa Ana, California, and was destined for the Camarillo Airport. Weather was cloudy with haze during the flight, and 37 minutes into the flight, the pilot initiated a climb with a gradual left turn to, as he told the air traffic controllers, to get above the layers. It was the beginning of a series of events that ended 2 minutes later with the tragic loss of the helicopter, its pilot, and all 8 passengers. On behalf of all of us at the NTSB, I'd like to offer our sincerest condolences to the families and friends of those who were lost in this tragic crash. Our purpose, our entire purpose for this investigation, is to learn from this event so that we can keep others from going through what you have gone through. In every accident, we study the roles of the human, the machine, and the environment. And today, at the juncture of human and environment, we'll discuss the aspects that influence the pilot's decision-making. He was flying under visual flight rules, or VFR, which legally prohibited him from penetrating the clouds. However, as we've seen in so many accidents, this pilot continued his VFR flight into clouds, or, as we say, instrument meteorological conditions. Today, we will discuss whether the pilot faced any pressure to complete the flight, and if so, where those pressures originated. What were the expectations of the pilot under the company policy? Did he put pressure on himself? And what actions could he have taken to avoid flying into the clouds? We'll discuss the phenomenon of spatial disorientation, which is the powerful, misleading sensation that confuses pilots conducting a visual flight who loses visual reference, and what types of training can be effective in countering this effect. We'll also discuss the organizations involved, specifically Island Express, which operated the flight, and the Federal Aviation Administration, which regulated the accident flight under Part 135 of the Code of Federal Regulations. That's the section regulating on-demand charter flights like this flight. The NTSB has long recommended life-saving changes to Part 135 operations. In fact, improving the safety of Part 135 aviation is on our most wanted list of transportation safety improvements. We'll discuss whether any part of the Part 135 changes that we've recommended, if acted upon, could have changed the outcome of this flight. For example, the NTSB has repeatedly recommended that the FAA require Part 135 operations to have a safety management system, or SMS, but that at the present, the FAA does not require SMS in Part 135, despite our repeated calling for it. Now, I will say that Island Express did have an SMS, but today we'll discuss the company's implementation of its SMS and the differences between it and a mandatory SMS, which would have been subjected to FAA oversight. The FAA has also recommended that flight data monitoring programs and devices capable to enable FDM be mandated by the FAA in Part 135 operations. FDM is a flight data recording and analysis tool to help pilots, instructors, or operators improve performance and safety. Today, we'll discuss the benefits of FDM as it relates to an operation such as Island Express. And we'll also discuss whether information might be missing from our discussion, because this helicopter did not have a crash-resistant flight recorder system capable of recording audio and images. Such systems can show, for example, visual cues associated with the adverse weather and the pilot's focus of attention in the cockpit. The NTSB has recommended that helicopter flights such as this one, the one we'll discuss, have such recorders. And this flight, this helicopter, did not have such a recorder. Now, each board member has studied the draft report, and each of us has met individually with the investigative staff. Today's board meeting, however, is the first time that we as a deliberative body will have gathered to discuss the report. Today, the staff will lay out the pertinent facts and analysis found in the draft report, and they will present draft findings, a probable cause, and recommendations to the board. And then we on the board will question the staff to ensure that the report that we adopt today truly provides the best opportunity to enhance safety. The public docket for this investigation contains more than 1,600 pages of additional relevant material, and it's available on our website at ntsb.gov. The report will also be available on our website in just a few weeks once any amendments voted upon today are incorporated and the report is finalized for release. At this time, I'd like for each of my colleagues on the board to introduce themselves. Vice Chairman Landsberg, good morning, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussions this morning.
It's great to see you. Member Hamady.
Little technical difficulty there. Hi, Jennifer Hamady, and good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to my colleagues on the board and within the agency, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great seeing you. Member Graham.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking forward to our deliberations today. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Graham. And Member Chapman.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, and my thanks to our team for the excellent work done on this investigation.
Great. I'll now ask that Deputy Managing Director for Investigations, Brian Curtis, to introduce the investigative and support staff who will be participating in today's board meeting. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you and good morning, Chairman Sumwalt. I'd like to also thank everyone who helped make this virtual board meeting happen today. My only administrative announcement this morning is a reminder for the meeting participants to silence all their electronic devices at this time. Now I will introduce the staff for today's meeting. Unless otherwise noted, staff members are from the Office of Aviation Safety. Dana Schultz, the Director for the Office of Aviation Safety. Bill English, Investigator in Charge. Mike Richards, Meteorology. Fabian Salazar, Operational Factors. Dr. Duan Civilian, Human Performance. Kathleen Silba, General Counsel for the NTSB. Darlene Hatchett, Director for the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Jim Ritter, Director for the Office of Research and Engineering. Brian Soper, Air Traffic Control. Chris Babcock, Crash Resistant Flight Recorder Systems from the Office of Research and Engineering. Van McKenney, Airworthiness. Adam Hooray, Airworthiness. Nathan Hoyt, Safety Recommendations from the Office of Safety Recommendations and Communications. Greg Borsari, Helicopter Maintenance and Visuals. And Kathy Gagne, Report Writer. The presentations will begin with an investigation overview by the investigator in charge, Bill English. Mr. English.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, and members of the board. On January 26, 2020, at 9:45 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, a Sikorsky S-76B helicopter, November 72 Echo X-ray, operated by Island Express Helicopters, collided with hilly terrain near the city of Calabasas, California. The pilot and 8 passengers were fatally injured, and the helicopter was destroyed by impact forces and fire. The helicopter was not equipped with a flight data or cockpit voice recorder, nor was it required to be. The flight was an on-demand charter, operated under the provisions of 14 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 135, to take the passengers from John Wayne Orange County Airport in Santa Ana, California, to the Camarillo, California Airport for a basketball tournament. The weather that morning included a widespread area of coastal clouds associated with a marine layer, a stable, humid air mass about 1,000 to 2,000 feet thick, often characterized by stratus clouds at its top and the potential for fog formation in some areas below. There were no hazardous conditions such as icing or thunderstorms. Mr. Richards will have further details on the meteorological factors in his presentation. The flight was operated with a single pilot under Visual Flight Rules, or VFR, as Island Express was not authorized to conduct passenger-carrying flights under Instrument Flight Rules. This is typical for helicopter charter operations. The pilot flying was Island Express's chief pilot, and he had been flying in the area for 10 years and had logged about 8,500 hours. Mr. Salazar will have further information about the pilot's pre-flight preparation and in-flight actions in his presentation. The flight departed at 9:07 and proceeded northwesterly across the Los Angeles metropolitan area. At 9:20, the pilot requested to transit the Burbank-class Charlie airspace, but ATC advised him to hold due to traffic. Weather in this area was reported as cloud ceilings 1,100 feet above ground level, with visibility 2.5 miles. About 11 minutes later, ATC provided special VFR clearance to proceed through the Burbank and Van Nuys airspace. Throughout this segment of flight, the helicopter was maintaining an altitude of about 500 feet above ground level. As the flight proceeded to the west out of the San Fernando Valley area, ATC advised the pilot that they would be too low for flight following, and they should contact Camarillo Tower as they got closer. The pilot acknowledged, and the helicopter proceeded to the west, following US Route 101 toward an area of rising terrain at a speed of about 140 knots. About 4 minutes later, the pilot contacted ATC again and advised them that he was intending to climb to go above the cloud layers. A surveillance camera near the 101 captured the helicopter about this time. The helicopter had been flying about 350 feet above ground level, but during the transmission to ATC began climbing at a rate of about 1,500 feet per minute, while generally following the 101 in a slight left turn. In this brief clip, you'll see the helicopter from the top right of the screen flying along the highway. During radio communications with ATC, the helicopter climbed through an altitude of 2,000 feet above sea level, or about 1,300 feet above ground level, by which point it was highly unlikely for the pilot to be able to maintain visual ground contact. The climb reached a maximum altitude of about 2,400 feet above sea level, as the helicopter continued a left turn diverging from the highway. The controller asked the pilot's intentions, and he said he was climbing to 4,000 feet. However, by that time, the helicopter was in a tightening left turn and descending rapidly. This maneuver is consistent with a pilot experiencing spatial disorientation in limited visibility conditions. Dr. Civilian will have further details on this phenomena in his presentation. The helicopter impacted hilly terrain on a generally northeasterly bearing at a high speed and descent rate. Safety issues include continued VFR flight into instrument weather conditions due to self-induced pressure and planned continuation bias, leading to spatial disorientation due to physiological factors, including inner ear vestibular illusions. Staff has made recommendations regarding spatial disorientation training and simulation, as well as reiterated recommendations for safety management systems for Part 135 operators and flight data recording and monitoring programs for Part 135 operators. Mr. Richards will now present on meteorological factors.
Good morning. I will be discussing the weather surrounding the accident flight. At the time of the aircraft's departure, Orange County, Burbank, Van Nuys, and Camarillo were all reporting ceilings greater than 1,000 feet. And only Van Nuys was reporting a visibility less than 3 miles. Regional Terminal Aerodrome Forecasts, or TAFs, which provide weather forecasts for airports that were current at the time of departure, forecasted for the flight period ceilings at 1,000 feet or greater and visibilities of 3 miles or greater, except Van Nuys, which forecasted a visibility of 2 miles until 9:30 that morning. It should be noted that no TAFs were valid for the accident location. Airmets for IFR conditions and mountain obscuration were issued prior to the aircraft's departure and were active for the accident location at the accident time. Weather information for the accident time consistently presented an environment characterized by low clouds and restrictions to visibility. The image on the top left depicts hilltops near the accident site at elevations of about 1,400 feet obscured by cloud, and is compared with a clear day image below it. The image on the right is from a camera looking toward the accident location from a position about 2 miles east at an elevation of about 1,300 feet. This image was captured about the time of the accident and depicted relatively smooth and unbroken cloud tops at 2,400 to 2,500 feet. As Mr. English presented, a camera captured the aircraft moving toward the west and disappearing from view about 1 minute prior to the accident. About this time, an eyewitness on the ground below the aircraft's flight path witnessed the aircraft below or at the cloud line before it disappeared into heavy clouds that they described as a thick wall. Also about this time, the aircraft began its climb from an altitude of about 1,400 feet to about 2,300 feet. Though it was heard, no local cameras or eyewitnesses saw the aircraft during its climb. However, staff could not determine conclusively if the pilot would have been able to maintain intermittent ground contact at points between 1,400 and 2,000 feet. Above 2,000 feet, instrument meteorological conditions, or IMC, prevailed. Thank you. Mr. Salazar will continue with his presentation.
Good morning. I will brief you on operations. Island Express Helicopters was operating on an FAA-approved operations specification document that authorized the pilots to conduct on-demand, day and night, visual flight rules only flights. The company had 25 employees and operated 6 helicopters. Island Express was experienced in conducting charter flights. In 2019 alone, they flew 495 charter flights, many catering to high-profile clients. Island Express occasionally received flight requests from an air charter broker who used them exclusively for the accident client's local aviation transportation requests. The pilot was certificated, current, and qualified to fly in visual flight rules in accordance with federal regulations and company requirements. He had about 8,577 hours flying experience, which included about 1,250 hours in the Sikorsky S-76 series helicopter and about 75 hours of instrument flying time. There was no evidence of any pre-existing medical conditions and no evidence of acute or chronic sleep loss. After gaining employment with Island Express, the pilot completed all required company training, including Sikorsky S-76 ground and flight training, which contained modules for aeronautical decision-making and judgment, instrument procedures, unusual attitude flight, procedures for recovering from inadvertent entry into instrument meteorological conditions, and spatial disorientation. As the chief pilot, he held the responsibility of supervising and training all Island Express pilots. Upon advancement to check airman, he gained the additional responsibility of evaluating Sikorsky S-76 pilots during their annual proficiency and line checks. Island Express contracted with an outside training vendor that reinforced the ground and flight training using the company's helicopters. Per company policy, pilots were to fly no lower than 300 feet above ground level, with 500 to 1,000 feet above ground level recommended as a minimum altitude. Company policy identified 1 nautical mile as the minimum visibility when operating in uncontrolled airspace. These company minimums were more conservative than the Federal Aviation Regulation Part 135 helicopter altitude and visibility minimums. Company policy stated that all flights were to be accomplished in accordance with federal regulations and required pilots to obtain a weather briefing from the approved weather sources, and in the absence of that, by whatever sources are available. About 2 hours before his departure from the John Wayne Orange County Airport, the pilot completed a flight risk assessment that was consistent with weather forecast available at that time. The flight risk assessment fell into the low risk category and required no further actions. The pilot developed a plan to avoid forecasted clouds by flying east and north of downtown Los Angeles and filed a company flight plan. The company's FAA Principal Operations Inspector and the outside training vendor used similar standards for evaluating pilots performing actions after inadvertently entering instrument conditions. While wearing a view-limiting device and referencing the helicopter's instruments, the pilot was to level the fuselage and pitch and roll, maintain the current heading, turning only to avoid known obstacles, apply climb power of 70 to 75%, and adjust the pitch attitude to attain a climb airspeed of 75 to 80 knots. After these steps were accomplished, the aircraft would be in a stabilized climb, and the pilot would then contact air traffic control, declare an emergency, announce instrument conditions, and request vectors to visual flight rules, or if those conditions were unobtainable, request a precision instrument approach to an airport. After arriving over Highway 101, the pilot followed the highway towards Camarillo at an altitude of about 450 feet over rising terrain and maintained an airspeed of about 140 knots while advancing towards a cloud layer. About 2 seconds after entering the clouds, the pilot notified air traffic control that he was climbing to get above the cloud layers. The pilot had immediately begun a rapid climb of about 1,500 feet per minute while in a slight left bank, and remained in a left bank of increasing magnitude throughout the remainder of the flight. During the climb and subsequent descent, the pilot communicated with air traffic control on numerous occasions but did not declare an emergency. The excessive speed, entering the clouds, the rapid rate of climb, and the left turn were inconsistent with his training. This concludes my presentation. Dr. Zobayan will brief you on human performance issues.
Good morning. I will discuss the following human performance issues in this accident: pilot decision-making, spatial disorientation, and safety management systems. Several factors may have influenced the pilot to place pressure on himself to complete the flight. For example, the pilot was preferred and trusted by the client, as was Island Express. The pilot likely took pride in these positions of trust with both the client and with Island Express. The pilot had a good relationship with the client and likely did not want to disappoint him by not completing the flight. This kind of self-induced pressure can adversely affect pilot decision-making and judgment. Accidents involving self-induced pressure are not uncommon. However, there was no evidence that Island Express, the air charter broker, or the client placed pressure on the pilot to accept the charter flight request or complete the flight in adverse weather. The pilot's flight in IMC was inconsistent with his demonstrated judgment and decision-making observed by company management and pilots. When the flight began entering IMC, it was about 25 miles away from Camarillo, which was reporting VFR weather conditions. Although conditions were deteriorating en route, an alternative course of action was not acted upon by the pilot. The pilot's continuation of the flight, despite deteriorating weather conditions, was representative of planned continuation bias, which strengthens as the pilot gets closer to the destination. Devising an alternative plan before departure would have aided the accident pilot's decision-making in flight concerning whether to continue the flight as originally planned or divert and land at an alternate destination. The pilot's statement to the air traffic controller that he was initiating the climb occurred about 2 seconds after the helicopter entered the clouds. Data show the climb started at a rate of about 1,500 feet per minute, accompanied by a gradual left bank to the left, generally following the US 101. As the helicopter continued climbing into the cloud layer, the pilot's loss of visual references would have required him to transition to the flight instruments to maintain awareness of the helicopter's attitude and track. The inner ear senses balance and orientation. When flying an aircraft and there's a lack of outside visual references, our inner ear can give us a false sense of orientation because our inner ear cannot distinguish between accelerations and tilt. If a pilot cannot see outside visual references, he must rely on flight instruments. When there are no outside visual references, the pilot is more susceptible to inner ear illusions. One common illusion that can trick a pilot's perception into believing he is flying straight and level, but he is in a steady turn, is called the leans. During the climb in IMC, the helicopter entered a steady left turn, conducive for the pilot to experience the leans. The vestibular system will usually detect initial rolling and turning movement. However, once the aircraft is stabilized in a steady rate of turn and angle of bank, the vestibular system will catch up with the aircraft, and the pilot can believe that the aircraft is straight and level when it is not. As the helicopter climbed, the air traffic controller asked the pilot to ident, which required the pilot to move his hand to the center of the instrument panel and press a button. The pilot's tasks associated with communicating with the controller and pushing the ident button introduced operational distractions from his primary task of monitoring the flight instruments. The resultant interruptions in the pilot's instrument scan, head, and hand movements would make him more vulnerable to misleading vestibular cues that could adversely affect his ability to effectively interpret the instruments and maintain control of the helicopter. The helicopter was in a left bank, rapid climb. Its bank increased, and it entered a tighter left turn that diverged away from US 101. The increasing bank would exacerbate the aspects of the leans. The resultant descent and acceleration were conducive for the pilot to experience a semi-graphic illusion, in which he would incorrectly perceive that the helicopter was climbing when it was descending. As the helicopter continued its steep descent, the pilot was either not referencing the helicopter's instruments or having difficulty interpreting or believing them due to the compelling vestibular illusions, and he did not successfully recover the helicopter. 2010 to 2019, the NTSB found that there were 184 fatal aircraft accidents related to spatial disorientation, 20 of which were fatal helicopter accidents. The NTSB has long recognized the value of cue-based and scenario-based pilot training to help reduce the risk of accidents involving continuation of flight under VFR into restricted visibility, a key risk factor for spatial disorientation. Simulation devices can provide representations of deteriorating weather conditions that cannot be realistically duplicated during flight training conducted in helicopters in VMC. This can help pilots safely practice decision-making skills and procedures needed to recognize and respond to changing weather conditions in flight. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. Effectiveness of spatial disorientation recognition and recovery training for helicopter pilots, the United States Helicopter Safety Team has established goals for promoting the wider use of spatial disorientation simulation technology. Increased use of this technology to supplement pilot training shows potential for helping pilots develop skills to detect and recover from vestibular illusions that could lead to spatial disorientation. Objective research to evaluate spatial disorientation simulation may help determine which applications are most effective for training pilots to recognize the onset of spatial disorientation and mitigate it. Staff has proposed a recommendation in this area. Company safety management system included safety policy, safety assurance, safety risk management, and safety promotion. The president of Island Express was aware of, but not involved with the SMS. The SMS was neither required by the FAA nor part of the company's FAA approved or accepted programs. And although the company used SMS tools, it did not implement the entire program and perform safety assurance evaluations, such as those that could have ensured the effectiveness of the flight risk analysis. The director of operations was the accountable executive and monitored flight risk analysis forms for necessary updates and followed up with pilots who forgot to submit forms for their flights. However, there was no evidence that company performed internal evaluation or hazard analysis using the information from completed forms as outlined in the SMS manual. Although the company had an SMS, our investigation showed that they did not effectively develop and implement the entire program. The NTSB has long advocated that the FAA require SMS for various Part 135 operations, Staff proposes reiterating a recommendation in this area. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Civilian. Mr. Chairman, that concludes our presentations, and staff is prepared to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. I want to thank staff for those presentations. I also want to thank the staff for a very good investigation. We try to complete our investigations within about 12 months, and you've hit that mark. So thank you very much for that. We'll now turn to the board member questions, and we will do 5 minutes per board member, and we will do as many rounds as we need to. So Vice Chairman Landsberg, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just make a statement. I'm really saddened by this crash, and we use the term crash rather than accident. And I think it's important to understand the distinction. An accident is something that is unforeseen, unpredictable, if you will. Unfortunately, this wasn't. We pretty well know what happened. We have a very good idea of why it happened, and we absolutely know how to prevent these kinds of crashes. And it's a leading cause of fatalities, as Dr. Civilian has pointed out. We're averaging one helicopter crash of VFR into instrument conditions every 6 months for the last 10 years. So I guess the question I have to ask is, what part of cloud, when you're on a visual flight rules program, do pilots not understand? I'd like to start by asking a question here about the autopilot, because autopilots are not subject to spatial disorientation. Mr. English, how effective was the autopilot on the S-76B?
Yes, Mr. Vice Chairman, this particular helicopter was equipped with a very sophisticated autopilot called a 4Q or 4-axis autopilot. It is actually certified for instrument flight, so it can control pretty much every aspect of the helicopter control.
So it's absolutely capable of flying the helicopter without pilot input, is that correct?
The pilot has to set it up and tell it what to do, but it can certainly control the helicopter very well.
So it could be set on heading and pitch. So when the pilot, after he missed the opportunities to turn around to land to start executing a alternative plan, he could have, as he entered the instrument conditions, set the autopilot up so it would stabilize the aircraft and continue a climb up through the clouds. Is that correct?
The typical training that helicopter pilots are given, including this helicopter pilot, and we know this for a fact, their training for inadvertent IMC is to level the aircraft using the flight instruments manually. That's quicker. And then, as appropriate, engage the autopilot, as you mentioned, and command an altitude hold or a heading to or climb to then exit the conditions.
Is it difficult to activate the autopilot? Is it a major distraction, or is it fairly straightforward?
It does depend on exactly what he wants to do with the autopilot, which is why they level the aircraft first, so it doesn't do some unintended command on the helicopter. But it is a part of his training, and the behavior that we see, the turn, the rapid climb, the maneuvers that they made were not consistent with the IIMC training that this pilot received.
And I think it was made very clearly, they were getting regular training on these kinds of operations. Is that correct?
That's correct. This is a regular part of their yearly proficiency training.
You know, one of the things is, as I was reading up about this crash, the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team and HAI, the Helicopter Association, have long come up with programs to deal with it. I think they had a program, still have, that's called Land and Live. And one of the things with helicopters is that you can put them down almost anywhere, a football field, something half the size of a football field, if necessary, unlike fixed wing where you need more space. In the training, did they have that kind of discussion?
As best we know, yes, they certainly did have that type of at least discussion and training. And it's also important for us to note that in this situation, this weather did not sneak up on the pilot very quickly. It was a condition that was very stable. So while you're absolutely correct, a helicopter can land in a very confined area, they also had a very easy alternative of landing at Van Nuys Airport, a large airport with lots of infrastructure just a few minutes away.
About how far behind them was Van Nuys? I'm assuming that's the closest one?
That was a close airport. It was roughly 10 to 12 miles behind them, depending on when they first started to encounter difficult conditions. So just a few minutes of flying time.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have more questions for later. Thank you.
Chairman, thank you very much. And Member Hamidi.
Thank you very much. I want to start out first by addressing the family, friends, and loved ones of the 9 people who died in the crash. Not only as a safety professional for the NTSB, but I'm also a wife and a mother of a 13-year-old girl. So I can't imagine how difficult today must be for you, and of course every day since January 26, 2020. So my heart goes out to you. And I'll get into this later, but after today, today is just the beginning of the board's action to improve safety, improve aviation safety, and to ensure that a similar accident doesn't occur again. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the board meeting. But first, I also want to thank the staff for all their work, and in particular, Bill English, who is the investigator in charge for this investigation of the crash. Bill, if you can go ahead and turn on your camera. I have a couple of questions. First, you did not mention helicopter terrain awareness and warning system in your presentation. Can you talk about why not?
Yes, ma'am. Certainly, helicopter terrain awareness and warning system, or HTAWS, is one of a number of technologies that are installed in aircraft or can be installed in aircraft that aid the pilots in, just like it sounds, their awareness of terrain. These devices are designed for a class of accidents we call CFIT, or controlled flight into terrain, in which the aircraft, while under control of the pilot, generally either in instrument conditions or maybe night conditions or other difficult conditions, the pilot is not aware of the terrain. Maybe they turn the wrong way or descend below a prescribed altitude. The system, using GPS and a detailed database and other equipment such as radar altimeters in the aircraft, can warn the pilot that they are about to come up close to dangerous terrain. We do have recommendations, as you yourself have talked about, to install this on helicopters. However, this scenario of this accident is not consistent with a controlled flight into terrain scenario. This pilot had every indication that he was aware of the terrain along the Highway 101 as it was rising towards Calabasas. The radar and ADSB returns that we have on the helicopter show he was doing a very good job of maintaining altitude above the terrain. And in fact, his intent was to climb away from the terrain. So at no time was he ever in that type of danger in the early portions of the accident. He already was aware of the terrain somehow. In the final seconds, the rapid descent into the higher terrain where the accident site was, at that point, the aircraft is not in control. As Dr. Civilian discussed, the pilot doesn't really know which way is up. So this type of system would not aid in that situation. It was beyond the parameters and would likely just be more of a confusing factor than anything else. So while it's great technology, we just don't think it applies here.
Thank you. And that's a great explanation. And let me ask you, you mentioned maintaining ground contact, helicopter operators and maintaining ground contact. And you mentioned him following the 101, and we had previously talked about him entering a slight left turn. Many people I've seen have said, well, he was probably just trying to turn around, trying to escape the weather. Why do we know that is not the case? And could you talk about what we do mean about maintaining ground contact?
Yes, I'll make it quick. I see the time is running short, but we're talking about visual ground contact, not physical contact with the ground. Helicopter pilots typically navigate by, just like it sounds, looking outside, looking at the ground. In the time period that you're talking about, as the pilot was nearing this slight rise in the grade of the highway, we can see that the helicopter begins to climbing into the clouds and lower visibility conditions. Most likely looking straight ahead, the pilot would see nothing but gray into the cloud. But it's possible to see the highway and houses and things looking straight down. That's consistent with the path of the helicopter. The highway bends slightly to the left there, and the helicopter follows that bend. So we believe that this is consistent with the pilot doing just that, unconsciously setting up that left turn, which then leads to the situation which Dr. Civilian described as the leans.
Thank you very much.
Member Hamidi, thank you very much. Great line of questioning. And Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've really struggled with this accident because I'm a career aviator, although a fixed wing aviator, not a helicopter pilot. But I spent a lot of time with this accident and looking at how helicopter operations actually work. So I spent a lot of time looking at the industry associations out there working with safety of helicopter operations, and I pull a few things from there. And one of the very interesting things about they talk about in spatial disorientation on a lot of their safety bulletins is what's the best cure for spatial disorientation, and it's their number one advice is never get into it in the first place. So never get into the weather. So I want to go over a little bit about how to avoid inadvertent instrument meteorological conditions. And I took this right off the United States Helicopter Safety Team's website. And first of all, it's get a good forecast for departure, en route, and arrival. And we believe this pilot did get that. We're not exactly sure what he updated before he left the Santa Ana airport, but we believe he was well aware of that weather en route. The next thing it says is check the weather ahead of you en route, use ATC and flight watch during flying. So do we have any evidence that he was checking the weather or was aware of the weather? It had changed from the forecast en route as he left Santa Ana and proceeded to the north?
Thank you, Mr. Graham, for that question, or Member Graham for that question. That is, it's hard to tell, but we do know one thing for sure, that he did obtain forecasts prior to departure. When he was approaching the Burbank and Van Nuys area, he did obtain the weather from the controllers in that area, which did show the current conditions of 2.5 miles visibility, which was actually somewhat less than forecast.
Okay. And he also, when he checked in with Burbank Tower, was he not updated on the weather, or should he have had an idea what the weather was? Because they told him it was what, IFR?
Correct. So either, I don't remember if it was that he tuned up the recorded weather or they just told him verbally, but yes, that's correct. The visibility was less than 3 miles in controlled airspace. So that considered IFR, at least for fixed wing aircraft. And that is slightly less than the forecast of 4 miles.
Okay, so he had some sense of what's going on there. The next thing about avoiding inadvertent IMC is avoid flight in marginal VFR weather. And we were already there, weren't we? As a matter of fact, we were below it there when he checked in with Burbank. He was actually below 1,003. He had 2.5 miles visibility. So didn't quite do that, but it's my understanding that this community will live with the lower minimums for the VFR only operations. Another advice to him is to plan en route decision points. Were we aware if he had any alternate plan or decision points along the way?
We're not aware of any of those.
We're not aware of any of those, yeah. The next thing it says is to recognize the signs. Deteriorating weather, obscured hills. Were there obscured hills en route?
Yes, there were.
There were, yeah. And other things would be fog. There was forecast fog. And what about visible precipitation? Was there any en route?
I don't believe there was visible precipitation. Mr. Richards might be able to clarify that for you.
Okay.
No, sir. No evidence of visible precipitation defined as hitting the ground.
Okay, thank you. Another recognized signs would be descent below planned altitude. I believe the operations recommended 500 feet AGL to 1,000 feet AGL. Had he gone below that?
That's correct on the recommendation. And as the flight proceeded westerly along the 101, the AGL altitude steadily decreased until about 350 feet when he initiated the climb.
Exactly. Okay, so again, it says assess the situation, and if signs back up the warnings, decide to land or turn around before you go into inadvertent IMC. Once you get into inadvertent IMC, you already talked about the training that he had from his training instructor and from his POI during check rides. The helicopter safety team points out, one of the things you need to do is the 4 C's: control, climb, course, and communicate. So you talked about controlling the aircraft, fly the aircraft, refocus the scan inside the cockpit to the primary flight instruments. That's airspeed, altitude, and attitude. Once you have that, climb. As soon as the aircraft is under control by referencing to the instruments, a controlled climb should be initiated. Inadvertent IMC encounters often occur at low altitudes where a rising terrain poses a serious threat. The pilot should initiate a straight ahead controlled climb to an altitude that will provide obstructive clearance in the area of operation. Did he climb straight ahead in that case when he penetrated the weather?
No, sir. The climb was initiated in a subtle left turn following the highway.
Subtle left turn. So he didn't follow his training. Do you feel he committed to the instruments in this case?
The path and behavior of the helicopter is not consistent with committing to the instruments.
Exactly. I agree with you wholeheartedly there. So, yeah, I'm just concerned about all this as a fellow aviator. He didn't even follow the training. So I see my time's about up. I just say, as long as we continue to have VFR only helicopters continuing to flirt with marginal weather and sometimes submarginal weather, low altitudes, low ceilings, limited visibility, unfortunately, a certain percentage of them will stray into inadvertent IMC, and unfortunately, a certain percentage of them will not come out alive. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great points, Member Graham, and thank you for those questions and comments. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was a tragic crash. The resulting loss of life is heartbreaking, and especially so with respect to the young people lost in the tragedy. I know I'm joined by my colleagues in seeking to ensure that some positive impact will result from the attention focused on this accident. The circumstances are painfully familiar to anyone with knowledge of trends in aviation safety. As we saw in the opening presentation from our investigative team, 184 fatal aircraft accidents occurring between 2010 and 2019 were related to spatial disorientation. 20 were fatal helicopter accidents. I am confident that many and perhaps most of these accidents involved pilots inadvertently flying into weather conditions for which they weren't prepared or equipped. As Member Graham pointed out very nicely, the lesson to be learned is for pilots to take this risk seriously, to adhere to their training, and to ensure they avoid the deadly risk posed by inadvertent flight into instrument weather conditions. To our investigative team, I know you're aware that I have a concern about identifying self-induced pressure as a contributing factor in the draft probable cause, which we'll consider at a later point in today's meeting. Certainly, it could be that self-induced pressure played a role, and it's reasonable to discuss it as a possibility, but there is little objective evidence on which to base the finding that it actually contributed to the pilot's decision-making, and to me, the conclusion seems speculative. Would you please elaborate on the findings of the investigation on this point?
Thank you, Member Chapman, for that line of questioning. Dr. Civilian is prepared to respond to that question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. The objective evidence that we collected at Island Express was through interviews. And what those interviews let us know was that the relationship between the pilot and the client had turned into a friendship over the years, that the client allowed the pilot to fly his children without him being present. And that type of relationship that they had was very close. And when we look at human factor psychology, we look at the decisions that people make based off of the perception of a situation. And in this case, the pilot, as he was flying en route, this type of relationship that he had with the client can lead to self-induced pressure during the en route portion of the flight. And so that is why it's the objective evidence from the interviews that helped us understand that relationship and the effect that it can have on pilot decision making.
So the premise is that self-induced pressure can result when someone has a relationship of trust, in this case with a prominent person. There's a tendency to want to please that person so the relationship can be maintained. I do have a concern that we don't have much in the way of concrete indications that that was actually what occurred in this situation, but I do understand the basic premise. The investigation also indicates that the phenomenon of planned continuation bias was a factor contributing to the pilot's decision to continue the flight. Is planned continuation bias dependent on an element of self-induced pressure? So in other words, is it possible there could have been planned continuation bias without any self-induced pressure of the type that you've described?
Well, in this case, it was both self-induced pressure and planned continuation bias. And the planned continuation bias portion of it was the pilot continuing the flight despite changing conditions.
Are there other accident investigations? This is kind of an unfair question because I suspect you haven't prepared for it, but are there other accident investigations conducted by NTSB in which it's been found that self-induced pressure was a factor and that the presence of self-induced pressure resulted from a relationship with a prominent person?
I have, there is evidence that the NTSB has investigated accidents involving self-induced pressure.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
Thank you, Member Chapman. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was per your last line of questioning, Member Chapman. I did notice that in our study that was done in 2005, risk factors associated with weather-related general aviation accidents, we did discuss in that the notion of planned continuation error or planned continuation bias, and so that's been prevalent in general aviation accidents. I know your question was more specific about the self-induced pressure, but planned continuation error is something certainly that we have seen in prior accidents. In fact, we define it as failure to revise the original plan when circumstances change, the type of error associated with poor in-flight decision-making and delayed remedial actions, types of accidents and incidents. I want to hit on something that has really, I've thought about for the last year. I remember right after the crash, one of the reporters covering it mentioned that the pilot may have been disoriented. And I think there's really two types of disorientation. There's the type of disorientation like you're lost. You might think you're over the I-5 freeway, but you're really over the 101. And that's not the type of disorientation that we're talking about here at all. We're talking about spatial disorientation, where literally the pilot may not know which way is up or down, whether he or she is leaning left or right. So I think it's important to draw that distinction. It's not like this crash, the pilot was just flying along, didn't know where the hills were, and blundered into the side of a hill. Do you agree with that, Mr. English? And I think that's consistent with the line of questioning that Member Hamidi was asking.
Yes, sir. The way you described it is exactly what we think.
And I too want to hammer the point that because this was a loss of control accident and not a control flight into terrain accident, that TAWS would not have prevented this crash. There's an article in the LA Times this morning that is talking about that. And I think a lot of people, including one of our former senior investigators, I read an article that he was quoted on on the anniversary of the crash, where he said he would expect the NTSB to issue a recommendation regarding TAWS. So I want to clear up that misconception there of the different types of disorientation. Mr. English, while I have you there, this aircraft was, in fact, it was IFR capable in terms of instrumentation. The aircraft itself was certified for IFR flight, but Island Express was not approved for IFR operations. Had they been so, what difference might that have made in this scenario?
Of course, would call for a little bit of speculation, but if you're asking about making this flight under IFR, for an appropriately certified IFR operation, this would not have been a difficult flight.
That's right, because instead of trying to scud run, and that's a term we use in aviation, instead of trying to stay under the clouds, you could have climbed up into the clouds and flown legally and safely if the pilot is properly trained and if the aircraft is properly maintained and certified for IFR. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
It would seem to me that if you are carrying passengers for charter, generally speaking, like this was a charter flight, it would seem to me that these flights should be operated under IFR. I realize that certain types of operations you cannot operate under an IFR clearance, such as logging or airborne law enforcement operations or sightseeing. But if you're carrying passengers for transport, it would seem safer that helicopter operations be approved for and operate under an IFR flight plan. We've seen numerous helicopter air ambulance crashes where the pilots are staying down low and they either run into something like ground or terrain or obstacles, or they climb up, they have an inadvertent IMC encounter. So I'm going to wrap it up here, but it would seem to me that that there would have been a business case for Island Express to have actually had their operation IFR certified. They canceled 150 flights in the previous year. And so anyway, I know we don't have a recommendation for this, but I believe that if flights could get up and fly in the clouds legally, there would be an increased safety margin. I'm out of time. Do you have any thoughts about that, Mr. English, given that I'm out of time?
I have nothing to add, sir.
Thank you very much. Vice Chairman Landsberg, we'll begin with you for the second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to explore that a little bit farther. Mr. Richards, I'd like to review a little bit more on the weather. So the forecasts at all of the weather reporting stations, we refer to them as TAFs, terminal area forecasts. How large an area around an airport does a TAF encompass?
So the forecast is valid, technically speaking, 5 statute miles from the center of the aerodrome. So we could say a radius of 5 statute miles around the airport.
So where the crash actually occurred, it was outside of the TAF area, is that correct?
Correct. It was significantly outside the closest TAF site, which would have been Van Nuys.
Okay. And there was also, I believe you referred to the term as AirMet. Could you explain the AirMet about IFR and mountain obscuration for some people who might not be familiar with that?
Sure. The AirMet is is a product that's issued by the Aviation Weather Service National Weather Center. It's intended to advise pilots of potentially hazardous conditions in areas that they may fly. In this case, the National Weather Service had issued 2 air mets. One was for IFR conditions, which in that context indicates ceilings less than 1,000 feet and or surface visibility less than 3 statute miles. And there was an air met issued for mountain obscuration, which is intended to convey that there is a threat of terrain in these areas may be obscured by cloud.
So in this case, it's also is it unusual that with the marine layer, as it comes in contact with the hills moving away from the ocean, that you would have the cloud layer coming down while the terrain is going up?
In a setup like this, it would not be, it wouldn't necessarily be a guarantee that you would find the low conditions at certain locations, but it would certainly not be a surprise. The ingredients are there for lower conditions, particularly in the area of variable terrain.
Is it possible that pilot reports might have helped, although I think most of the aircraft that would be departing from the airports might not be low enough in order for this to be evident? As you know, I happen to believe in pilot reports because what's forecast and what actually happens is sometimes a little bit different, and there's nothing better than having somebody look out the windshield and see what's going on.
Pilot reports are a very important source of weather information for pilots, both on frequency and then if they're collected by, say, air traffic controller. If they're disseminated long line, they're available across the world if someone needs to read those. Important.
I'd like to also talk just a little bit about the TAWS situation. We've already mentioned that TAWS wouldn't have helped, and we know that this helicopter was not equipped with TAWS. Mr. English, was the pilot using, or do we know that he had an electronic flight bag on board? And could you describe a little bit about that?
Yes, sir, Mr. Vice Chairman. The pilot typically used Preflight, which is a commercial electronic flight bag, works on an iPad, very popular amongst pilots. What that software does, running on the tablet, is charts, other information about airports, and it does include some other features such as it's rudimentary, it's not certified, but it does include a hazard advisory feature, depending on which level that you buy, that using the terrain, the chart database, and the GPS position that's fed into the iPad to aid the aware of surrounding terrain.
So I'm familiar with it because I use it myself, and it includes a terrain. It'll give you a terrain warning. You also have the option of synthetic vision. If you want to select that, it's merely a button push. And it also provides you with the weather conditions at all of the surrounding airports, which we know isn't necessarily helpful because we're outside of the TAF area. But I think the biggest thing we have to say on this is, again, the pilot is in the best position to see what's going on. He knew the terrain. He'd been flying in this area for a decade. He had over 8,000 hours, and he could look out the windshield and see that he was getting into instrument conditions and went contrary to all of his training. I'll stop here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman, thank you very much. And Member Hamidi.
Thank you very much. My questions are probably going to be for Dr. Civilian. The accident pilot completed a risk assessment form at 6:57 a.m. the morning of the flight, and at some point before departure, which I believe was at 9:07 a.m., there was a change in weather forecasted at Van Nuys. And I'm just going to read here. During the time the pilot was on the ground, weather information for Van Nuys included visibility of 2.5 miles, reported at 7:51 a.m. and again at 8:51 a.m., which was less than what had been forecasted. Island Express requires a new form when the weather changes. That did not occur. But what would have changed on the form if a new form had been completed with that information?
The flight, the risk assessment still would have been within the low risk category, and Mr. English could provide information on what would be changed in terms of
right. And just to add to that, my understanding is at that point he would have had to check special visual flight rules and route, correct?
Right.
Okay. So, and this is where I want to, and this may be you or it may be Mr. English. Feel free to pop up, Mr. English. On that one, if he completed the new risk assessment form and checked off special visual flight rules and route, it would have required an alternative plan to be developed. Is that correct? Now, I understand he would have had to go back and speak with the director of operations, who apparently said he trusted the accident pilot to make decisions based on his experience. And so that wouldn't have made a difference. But what would have made a difference is an alternative plan would have been filed.
Yes, ma'am. So let's unpack that a little bit. There's a couple things going on. The changes in the forecasts that we can see with hindsight, none of them would have triggered special VFR en route, other than one TAF period from Van Nuys, which it's questionable whether or not that actually even applied at the time that they would have planned to transit that airspace. But using worst case scenario, let's assume he got that forecast, checked special VFR en route. It's important to note, as Mr. Salazar brought up in his presentation, the VFR weather minimums for helicopters outside of controlled airspace is much lower than that. For fixed wing, helicopters are routinely flown in less than 3 miles visibility. And special VFR is simply and only applies in controlled airspace, such as Burbank or Van Nuys. It would require them to get a clearance to go through that airspace, but to fly in the same weather that they were already flying in until that point. So the mitigation or the alternative plan might be simply nothing more than obtain special VFR clearance, which helicopter pilots do routinely. But that's not as much of a red flag as far as weather as it is more of an air traffic delay and procedure type of thing, which we saw happened. They got a little bit of a delay due to air traffic.
I guess what I'm asking is, why wasn't there an alternative plan? An alternative plan could have helped. At the time at 8:37, he had a conversation with OC that mapped. He pointed to a map that said he planned to go north to Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles around Burbank and follow State Route 118. At some point after Van Nuys, he enters IMC around, and you and I discussed this, 9:44 and 45 seconds, sometime between there and 9:45 and 10 seconds. That's 35 seconds. I mean, that's not a lot of time. And so why wouldn't it have helped if you had an alternative plan in mind rather than a quick decision making?
Yes, ma'am. We're now moving past the special VFR area, and other than using that as just an indicator that things may not go exactly as you plan. In a global sense, and I may hand this to Dr. Civilian, in a global sense, this is one of the things we found with the operator. They were not set up to have, we're not talking about weather alternates or things like that, but the alternative methods of getting the job done, the infrastructure there to help these pilots out if they do have to divert and assist the passengers in getting to where they're going, which those type of things can reduce the self-induced pressure that we've already discussed. And Dr. Civilian, if we have a few more seconds, might be able to piggyback on that a little bit.
Yes, Island Express did not have any documentation or anything for that matter regarding alternative plans, and so that wasn't available to the pilot.
Right, and I do want to get into that a little bit more in the next round of questioning on the risk analysis, this actual risk assessment form and SMS. So with that, I'm out of time.
Member Hamidi, thank you very much. And Member Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you stated during the presentation, we've seen this accident before, unfortunately. Helicopters continuing VFR flight into instrument meteorological conditions, and unfortunately lose control of the aircraft due to spatial disorientation. In the last 7 or 8 years, what has the FAA or the industry done to try to eliminate this type of accident?
I think Dr. Civilian has some background on some efforts in that area.
Thank you.
Yes, alongside the training that pilots take, there's a lot of guidance from industry associations regarding what a pilot should do if they get themselves into this situation. The United States Helicopter Safety Team has also worked on procedures and documentation to help pilots understand the risk associated with flying into instrument meteorological conditions. So there's a lot of effort there by the industry to help pilots in those circumstances.
Thank you. Yeah, they've done good work, like land and live programs. I know they push that. Some other things I've noticed that the FAA raised the minimum flight visibility for helicopters to a half mile, which is up from much lower, but it's still very limited visibility. I noticed air ambulance pilots, they've required them to hold instrument ratings, and also for the air ambulance helicopters to have the HTOS system. They've also required Part 135 helicopters to have radar altimeters and to be trained for inadvertent IMC, which this pilot and this aircraft actually have. But it looks like from the data that the statistics that this really hasn't helped a whole lot. As a matter of fact, we still average about 2 of these types of accidents a year, so it hasn't changed much. I'd like to switch over to instrument ratings. I know I'd like, at least for the fixed wing operators, probably don't understand instrument ratings as far as helicopters go. So is it, this pilot, I think we put out that he had about 75 hours of instrument time. Do we know if any of that time was in a actual simulator, or was it all simulated in the actual helicopter?
I don't know that we have it broken down that to that much granularity. Mr. Salazar can break it down as best we know.
Sir, we only have a resume or a documentation from Island Express that showed the 75 hours of instrument time, but it didn't break it out into simulator versus actual aircraft.
Okay. Did I actually see something that we might believe he only had 7 or less than 7 hours of actual instrument time?
There's no documentation that shows any of his actual instrument time, sir.
Okay. Okay. So we don't know. And actually, through my research, I found out, and this isn't the whole helicopter industry, but this is a vast majority of them have very little actual instrument time. A lot of them have very little simulated time in a simulator by being in a vision device, in reduced vision of device in an actual helicopter. So I know there are some instrument pilots out there in helicopters that actually have no actual instrument time, which is hard for a fixed wing pilot to believe, but that's not very conducive for good training and good instrument time. Is instrument flying a perishable skill?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
yes,
it is. And do we know if this pilot was actually instrument current?
We do not have documentation to support that he was instrument current.
Yeah, and I think we find in much of this VFR only operations that many of the pilots are not instrument current. So, and instrument flying being a perishable skill, once you do enter an inadvertent IMC situation, it'd be very, very difficult to transition to your instruments and trust them if you're not current on them. And I see my time's up, so thank you very much.
Member Graham, thank you very much. Member Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some questions about safety management systems. In 2016, NTSB recommended to FAA that all Part 135 operators should be required to implement safety management systems. Since then, the original recommendation to FAA has been reiterated by NTSB 4 times, each time based on our findings from investigations and other fatal accidents involving Part 135 operators that did not have a fully implemented safety management system subject to FAA oversight. Today, it's likely we will again reiterate the recommendation to FAA. This would be for a 5th time, and essentially this is 5 years after the initial recommendation. Apparently, there are some indications that FAA is considering action on this, but it appears to be a longer-term initiative for the agency. Is that correct, and how confident are we that FAA will eventually act on the recommendation?
I think Dr. Civilian has been tracking the SMS process and can answer that for you, sir.
Mr. Hoyt, who's in recommendations, can provide an update on the current situation.
Thank you.
So in the fall of 2020, during the FAA's rotorcraft safety conference, the FAA administrators said that they were hoping to publish a proposed SMS rule in 2022 that would apply to air taxis, Air 2 operators, and others. It's also on OMB's fall 2020 unified agenda of regulatory and deregulatory actions, listed as a long-term action item. So it's looking like the FAA is making some progress, but there's nothing. We still don't have an NPRM or a final rule out.
So some encouraging signs, but certainly not imminent. This next question, I'm not sure who is best equipped to answer it. This has to do with the effort underway in anticipation of our most wanted list. You all are aware that work is underway in preparation for the adoption of the NTSB's 2021-2022 most wanted list. And I see that requiring safety management systems in all commercial aviation operations is among the issues under consideration. Am I correct that the primary audience for that proposed most wanted list item would be industry, associations, and operators, and not the FAA? Whoever can speak to that best, I appreciate an answer.
Yeah, I think, again, that would be Mr. Hoyt's area.
Yes, if you could repeat your question one more time, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it has to do with the work that's underway on the next version of our most wanted list. The proposal to focus on safety management systems for all commercial operators, that effort appears to me, from the materials provided to us, that appears to be focused on essentially on industry adoption of safety management systems, not on FAA taking action to require safety management systems. Is that correct?
Well, it would be both. I mean, we're wanting to reach out to industry so that they can voluntarily adopt, implement an SMS program, but we're also still wanting the FAA to require that.
So obviously we're sticking to our guns in terms of pressing FAA, but it sounds like we have more hope of progress when it comes to encouraging the industry to take voluntary action.
Correct.
Today, I don't anticipate that we'll make any broad recommendations to industry regarding adoption of safety management systems. Are we missing an opportunity to do so?
We have recommendations out to industry and specific operators as a result of previous investigations. So we I believe staff feels that those are adequate.
Okay, so you're comfortable that essentially we're not passing up a good opportunity today, that we already have enough out there in terms of solid recommendations that that we can build on.
Correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time's expired.
Member Chapman, thank you very much. I want to follow up to something that Member Graham brought up, and I was looking in the draft report, as Mr. Salazar said, and Mr. Salazar, I think this would be for you. It does indicate that he had around 75 hours of, around 75 hours of instrument flying time, of which 68 hours were flying under simulated instrument conditions. And so apparently he did not have a lot of hard actual instrument time. Can you explain, and you're a very experienced helicopter pilot. I know we don't like to speak about ourselves, but how many hours do you have in helicopters?
About 6,500, sir.
I'd say that's pretty darn experienced. And so can you describe what just flying under the hood, if you will, with a view restricting device, how would that be different than just flying along and all of a sudden entering clouds somewhat unexpectedly? How would that differ for a pilot's performance?
View limiting devices are good training aids for flying instruments, but they do give the pilot the ability to look around them. And as it's stated, one peak is worth 1,000 cross checks. Going to flying actual instruments, there's no cheating the system by looking over a set of view limiting devices. You're committed to the instrument conditions, which forces you to commit to the actual flight instruments.
Thank you. And would you would you agree that there might be somewhat of an element of surprise if you're flying under a view limiting device, then you've had time to acclimate to your instrument scan versus if you're flying visually and all of a sudden you encounter instrument conditions? Could there be somewhat of a element of surprise associated with that, which would potentially also affect your performance?
Yes, sir. Being prepared for the instrument conditions is part of the secret to success of flying instruments. When it's a surprise and you're unprepared for it is when unfortunate bad things happen or have the possibility.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure exactly who this question would be directed towards, but the FAA's literature on aeronautical decision-making points out the importance of making the proper no-go decision, because if you make the wrong no-go decision, then you have the possibility of introducing more errors, more significant errors downstream. So making the proper no-go decision is critical. So based on the weather information that was available to the pilot at the time that he departed, was it an appropriate decision to begin that flight?
Mr. Chairman, even with the hindsight that we have of the weather conditions and knowing what was available to the pilot, we don't see that the weather conditions were such that should have necessarily affected the initiation of the flight. Having said that, your point about the error chain is exactly correct as far as in-flight aeronautical decision-making. As things cropped up along the flight that were indicating that things were not as good as maybe they would have hoped, that should have started the aeronautical decision-making process going and to make a different plan. But there's nothing there that should have said no-go.
Great, thank you. And just looking at it, I mean, the lowest visibility was 2.5 miles and the company minimums were 1 mile. So based on what he knew at the time, that does not appear to be an inappropriate go decision.
That's correct, sir. The conditions that we see, even up until the accident site, were at no point below the minimums for a helicopter. It was the in-flight decisions, the pressing on at high speed, that was where the ADM breakdown occurred.
Thank you very much. So quickly, I don't have a lot of time. There was an article in Bloomberg this morning that said that there were really two things that some experts had said could improve helicopter safety, one of which I've already hit on, was the requirement for flights to be conducted under an instrument flight plan. And the other was involving 2 pilots. And what safety advantages might we have gotten from if we had two pilots? I realize the helicopter was certified for single pilot operation, but are there any benefits that we might get from two pilots?
You're correct, sir. This operation was certified for two pilots. Dr. Civilian has looked into the particular issues that would key a two pilot versus one pilot safety factor.
Well, thanks. And I realize I'm out of time, but I'd like, if my colleagues would indulge me, I'd like to just continue this line of questioning, and then we'll take a break after that. But go right ahead, Dr. Civilian. Appreciate it. I'd love to hear your viewpoint.
Yes, there are benefits of having two pilots cross-checking one another. There's communication with another pilot. But again, there are also safety aspects that we have to consider here, is that there's always going to be a possibility of miscommunication with two pilots from that standpoint. But there's also workload implications just having one pilot.
So in other words, if you had two pilots, one could have assisted if this one pilot had spatial disorientation. The other pilot could have helped to monitor and correct the situation. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think it's interesting that this helicopter, this exact same helicopter, when it was operated by its previous owner, they operated it exclusively, I believe, with two pilots. And also Chevron Oil had conducted a safety audit, and Chevron was approved to use this particular helicopter with Island Express if it had one pilot or two pilots. Which was it?
Mr. English could give you an update.
It was two pilots. Two pilots. Is that correct, Mr. English?
Yes, sir. Chevron, as is typical of the offshore oil rigs, requested two pilots for this type of operation. And what we're saying is not that it's unsafe, but we don't have indications of those type of workload issues in this accident. And as far as, two pilots in the cockpit, we have Spatial D accidents with two pilots in the cockpit as well.
Well, I wouldn't really agree with that. I think that two pilots would increase the safety level. I flew with two pilots for a long time in an airline environment, and I think that you do get the redundancy that if you had one pilot who was struggling with flying the controls, the other pilot would be able to sit back and say, "Wait a minute, you're banking 30 degrees to the left. Now you're starting a descent." So I don't want to discount at all the importance of two pilots, and so I think a line of questioning that we'll ask that we might start later is, how does the consumer make a discriminating choice on what he or she is hiring? So we're going to take a break. Before we go into the break, I'd like to invite all participants to mute their cameras and their cameras and their microphones. We will take a break and we will reconvene at 11:10, and we are in recess.